The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the game fans waited the better half of a decade for, but was it worth it? After being delayed more than we would have liked, was the extra time put to good use and did it deliver on Nintendo's promise of revolutionizing a franchise that in its own right had already revolutionized the gaming industry? If you put your faith in review scores, the answer is yes. If you like developing your own opinions, the answer is most likely still a yes. Without a doubt, Breath of the Wild fully deserves all the praise it is getting, but even some of the best games have issues that could have been fixed or features that seem missing that, if taken care of, could have made the game even more enjoyable. I'm not suggesting a game that is making perfect 10s everywhere would suddenly be an 11 out of 10, but with Breath of the Wild being praised by many fans and websites, we decided to reach out on Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, and Zelda Amino asking everyone their opinions on the game. Your answer may even show up on this list, or if left in the comments, could end up on a follow-up video. So remember to like, subscribe, and comment below so you don't miss out on future videos in this series. Remember, these are the most common complaints and praises from fans like yourself for Breath of the Wild.
Just like my first video in this series covering Ocarina of Time, I will be covering mine and everyone else's top 5 favorite things and top 5 worst things about Breath of the Wild. This will be structured in a top 10 list, alternating between the worst and the best. For example, number 10 will be something that could have been improved. Number 9 will be a positive about the game that everybody liked. Number 8 will be a negative, and so on. So, with all of that out of the way, let's begin.
Number 10. The Rain. While having a dynamic weather system is great and certainly achieves its goal of making the world feel more real, nothing sucked worse than being in the middle of climbing a huge hill or mountain so you can get to that hidden shrine or destination you needed to reach to finish a quest, and suddenly it begins raining, which means at worst, you're falling to your death, and at best, you spend several minutes waiting for the rain to stop. This gets even worse when you're needing to light some torches and the rain puts out your fire. Number 9. The temperature mechanic. This isn't anything new for the Zelda series. Ocarina of Time and other Zelda games have had this same mechanic, but Breath of the Wild takes this simple notion and really opens it up. For example, in Ocarina of Time, you couldn't go inside Death Mountain without the Goron tunic to protect you from the heat. In Breath of the Wild, not only do you have to worry about it being too hot, you also have to worry about it being too cold, and on top of this, certain areas have different levels of how hot or cold it gets, just like in real life. Which means you're literally forced to change up your armor and explore to find as many outfits as you can. If your favorite Zelda game is Twilight Princess, I'm sure you'd prefer going through most of the game in the Hero of Twilight tunic, just for the nostalgia. If you aren't the best at combat, perhaps you prefer keeping something on like the ancient armor because of its high defense, especially against guardians, which are everywhere. However, take the Twilight tunic to Death Mountain or a snowy area, and you're going to have a bad time. By doing this, the game forces you to go outside your comfort zone, explore a bit, and in doing so, you unlock the different bonus attributes of wearing a complete set. Alternatively, if you can't find a certain outfit that is suitable for wearing in that area, logic works perfectly. In an area that's cold, just carry around a torch. The same works for elemental weapons. An ice blade will keep you cool in the desert, for example. It's brilliant and something most people wouldn't even think to implement.
Number 8, overpowered. When Breath of the Wild begins, you're naked, your weapons consists of sticks, leaves, and when you find an actual bladed weapon, it breaks in just a few hits. On top of this, you have 3 hearts, which means most enemies can wreck you in just one hit. However, once you leave the Great Plateau, get used to the fighting system, and progress just a bit, you're able to use pot lids to take down guardians, which, at first, the only method of confronting one and surviving is running away. Now, you're literally using the weakest shield in the game to destroy what should be one of the most terrifying enemies. Once you progress even further and unlock the champion abilities, the game just gets ridiculous. Once you have just half of the maximum amount of hearts, and your gear has been upgraded just once or twice, and the champion abilities, if you die, it's likely because you, for some reason, wanted to. Or, because of our previous complaint, it began raining when you were climbing halfway up a giant mountain. And when you die, thanks to your new special abilities, you just get brought back to life. Even the dungeon bosses and the main boss are incredibly easy. I know the game is meant to be played and beaten by kids. After all, it is a Nintendo game, but maybe with the DLC, perhaps the hard mode will actually add a challenge. I would like for enemies to have new attacks and an overall higher difficulty, instead of just replacing the enemies with silver versions, which we'll get into a bit later.
Number 7. Majora's Mask 2. Breath of the Wild, without a doubt, has references and connections to literally every Zelda game. We have Hyrule Castle from Twilight Princess. The Temple of Time looks like it was pulled directly out of Ocarina of Time. We even have the Twin Peaks from the original game's artwork. But while I play the game, the strongest connection I've seen is to Majora's Mask. Nintendo themselves even posted a video and several pictures of connections Breath of the Wild has with the original NES title, but I feel it may unintentionally have an even stronger connection to Majora's Mask. The main boss and main area of the game is located in the very center of the map. In Majora's Mask's case, we have Clocktown in the center of Termina and Majora as the boss. In the case of Breath of the Wild, we have Hyrule Castle at the center of Hyrule with Ganon as the boss. You can go directly to the main boss in both cases, and in both games you get an alternative ending than if you would have actually played and beat the entire game. Though, in Majora's Mask you won't actually be able to kill the boss or even see him, but in a way you can still confront Majora and you are met with an alternative ending, which is the moon crashing and destroying Termina. An even bigger connection, Majora's Mask and Breath of the Wild have 4 main dungeons with 4 main bosses. Each dungeon is located in a specific area on different sides of the map. Both games have a main story that can be rushed through and finished without even really understanding the world. However, the real story is told by talking to all the different NPCs and doing side quests. Depending on what time of day it is, certain NPCs will be in different areas and different side quests will be available. Each area has its hero or important character that has died due to the evil in the world. You gain a special ability from them, whether it's a mask that turns you into a Deku and allows you to pop up high in the air and glide to your destination, or an ability from the Rito that does the same exact thing.
Number 6. The leveling system. In most Zelda games, you aren't necessarily leveling up. Your power is directly related to how many hearts you have or how strong the specific item you are using is. With Breath of the Wild, similar to the complaint about Link becoming overpowered, I'm not a fan of how the game handles the leveling up of enemies as you become stronger. A quick example Zelda fans will understand is with A Link to the Past. If you make it to the Dark World and are introduced to a screen full of enemies that all take several hits to kill, and you only have 6 or 7 hearts, it's going to be difficult. However, if you return to the same area later in the game with your hearts maxed out and every item upgraded, including the golden sword, that same screen full of enemies are going to be exactly as strong as they were the last time you faced them. The only thing that's changed is how powerful you have now become, which makes them easier to kill, and in doing so, you feel accomplished. You feel all of the time spent leveling up the Master Sword and gaining more hearts was worth it. In Breath of the Wild, the same screen full of enemies will just level up alongside you, so when you return, it's going to be just as challenging as it was before. When promoting Breath of the Wild, Nintendo mentioned that the only limits would be the enemies you come across, and that is what determines the path you go on, which I thought was great, and they did this, but only to a certain extent. As you level up, so do the enemies. By the end of the game, you'll have noticed that almost every enemy has now turned silver, which in Breath of the Wild is the strongest color of enemy, whereas typically you wouldn't ever really come across them early on in the game. Some areas are filled with enemies who are stronger than what you would normally come across, but usually the enemies will level up with you, which takes the fun out of becoming more powerful in the first place. And I know it kind of conflicts with my statement about being overpowered, but really, it just comes down to how the game handles it, and Breath of the Wild does this in a negative way. In my favorite types and uses of a leveling system in games, you're blocked from going to certain areas by simply not being powerful enough or skillful enough to pass through, which, again, for the most part, is what Breath of the Wild does. As an example, maybe you're level 5 and a level 20 or 30 monsters blocking the way. In the case of Breath of the Wild, you have a swarm of guardians or a group of some other enemies keeping you from traveling a certain path, which is fine. It's how they handle the enemies once you level up. Going back to my example, you will need to leave and come back once you have the skill to pass. If you're a good enough player, you could beat them while you're still a level 5, even though they're at level 30, or you'll have to grind and come back once you've reached a higher level. However, in Breath of the Wild's case, when you gain some extra hearts, higher level armor, and weapons, then return to the same area, now all of those red bokoblins, Lizalfos, or Lynels are now blue or silver, which essentially means your higher level gear and the extra hearts you spent hours earning doesn't mean as much. It's still a great game with amazing combat. I just wish the rubber banding of the leveling system was handled slightly better. But you can still return to the Great Plateau when you've progressed halfway through the game and get some payback on that guardian that terrorized you when you first began your playthrough. So not everything is lost.
Number 5. The World. Breath of the Wild is huge, which is great. A huge worry though that many people had was that it was going to feel empty, like Twilight Princess, which had a huge overworld for the time, but had nothing to do in it. So instead of focusing on a huge world with nothing to do, Nintendo focused on smaller areas that had tons of things to do. We saw this in Skyward Sword, but then people complained about not having the sense of exploration and a connecting world. So Nintendo took the praises and negativity from both games and actually listened to the fans. We get the huge connecting overworld of Twilight Princess with the complexity of the smaller areas in Skyward Sword, which means no matter where you go or what you do in Breath of the Wild, you'll never be stuck with nothing to do or crossing an empty field just to get to the other side. You may think an area is empty, but chances are you're just not paying attention. With 120 shrines, 900 Koroks hidden throughout the overworld, most of which requiring overworld puzzles to complete, the many different towns or villages located all over the map, hidden overworld bosses, dozens of stables, a lot of different ruins of towns that have been destroyed, like the remains of Lon Lon Ranch. The world is literally filled with things to do and not so much that it becomes overwhelming.
Number 4, the music. I would say Nintendo games in general are known for their classic music. Most of this is because of Koji Kondo. However, while Breath of the Wild does have great music, it isn't a soundtrack that I would choose to listen to if I wasn't playing the game. Some of the music is great. Hyrule Castle does some amazing orchestrated pieces as well as a few other areas. The Temple of Time has a super slowed down version of a classic Zelda fan favorite. The stables have a few notes that remind us of Epona song, but nothing too memorable. This is because Nintendo chose to go a different path. And while I do like the music of Breath of the Wild, it just didn't resonate with me at first. The way they implemented the soundtrack was done so in a way that would connect more with how you were actually playing the game. If you're just wandering around Hyrule Field, you'll get a few notes on a keyboard and a peaceful ambient sound. When you get close to an enemy or enter into a fight, the tempo picks up, you'll hear more instruments, and an overall more aggressive sound. It works great for connecting you to the world, and is original in its own way, but it just doesn't stick out in the same way the theme from Clocktown, Zelda's Lullaby, or the Lost Woods theme does. When you hear those songs pop up in a new game, you get a flood of nostalgia. Even newer games like Skyward Sword introduced great songs like Skyloft's theme or The Ballad of the Goddess. However, Breath of the Wild's dynamic approach to a new soundtrack, while it may be what's best for the overall experience with Breath of the Wild, it doesn't feel as memorable to me. Number 3, the structure of the game and story. I wanted to title this The Story, but ended up adding the story into the overall experience because it plays a huge part in how the gameplay is structured. The actual story of Breath of the Wild is on par with some of the best in the series. When people complain about the motion control of Skyward Sword, I always follow up with how great the story is. And if you can get used to the controls, it's one of the best stories you will get out of a Zelda game. With Breath of the Wild, there are no bad gameplay mechanics that push people away, which is a bonus thing for why Breath of the Wild is so great. The game is built in such a way that you can go anywhere and do anything from the very beginning of the game. Once you make it off of the greatest of plateaus, you're free. A departure from past games that hold your hand and guide you, or have a horrible introduction that can take forever. No matter where you go or what you do, the game gives you and teaches you everything you need to know from the very beginning. In past Zelda games, if a path was blocked by ice or a tree, you were stuck until you could get certain items. For instance, in Ocarina of Time, you couldn't cross the bridge to Gerudo Fortress unless you had the Longshot or Epona. In Breath of the Wild, if you can't pass across a certain path, You're free to chop down a tree and make your own bridge. Or if you can't make it to a shrine because thorns are in the way, you have that moment where it's like, maybe I can just burn the thorns and make them disappear. So if I just shoot a fire arrow, and the logic actually works perfect. Alternatively, you could climb a hill close to it and glide to the shrine, or walk all the way around the hill the cliff is on and look for a different path. If a rope is holding something up, simply cut the rope with an arrow or by throwing something, and you can solve whatever the problem is. Nothing is off limits, and because of this, the story is told in a genius way. Instead of getting the cutscenes or story in a specific order, because there is no boundaries on where you go or what you do, you can get the story out of order, so your experience can be completely different than your friends, but you'll still be able to understand everything that you need to know about the world. Number 2, a lack of variety in themed dungeons. I'm out of room to make for the negatives, as this is one of the biggest complaints that I have for the game, but just like my number 1 favorite and worst thing about Ocarina of Time, the best and the worst thing about Breath of the Wild kind of blends together. Playing through the game, I kept running into small little quirks. Why are there no traditional themed dungeons? All of the shrines have the same blue aesthetic, and even the actual dungeons are all sort of similar, as well as the bosses. I mean, Water Blight Ganon and Fire Blight Ganon, although technically opposites, they are still very familiar. It reminds me of Skyward Sword wasting mini boss fights on Girahim. There's no real reason to fight him 3 different times, especially if it takes up what could have been a great boss fight. I came across certain areas of water where I thought it would be cool to dive down in. A great thing about Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time was being able to explore underneath the water, but with Breath of the Wild, this was a feature I thought the game was constantly lacking. Another complaint was how they didn't add in loft wings. I mean, how amazing would it have been to fly over this huge world of Hyrule on a loft wing? Even having a boss fight on a loft wing would have been incredible. If you remember the parasite on the flying well in Skyward Sword, just imagine how epic it could be in this game, especially having a situation where you do your slow motion jump off of a loft wing, pull your arrow out while you're hundreds of feet in the air, get a few shots in on your enemy, then glide back to your loft wing to move on and continue the fight. So whether it's combat or just having a great view of the beautiful landscapes in Hyrule, this is something that could have only made the game better. Now, this is where all of these complaints adds up to making it a positive, because despite all of the flaws that I mentioned, the game is still nearly perfect, and is now one of the best reviewed games of all time. So imagine Nintendo taking what they learned, breaking the tradition with the Zelda series, and creating this huge open world. This was Nintendo's first try at making a Zelda game on this scale. So imagine all of the experience they have and everything they've learned from it. Then building a brand new world on this scale, which could end up even larger and have an even better version of the physics engine or combat engine. Even more outfits, weapons, and abilities. Then that would even give them a chance to do everything that was so great about this game and actually add in all of those familiar songs everybody loves. They can incorporate those themed dungeons, fire, water, forest, and even a shadow temple. They could even add in the loft wing for a mechanic that would allow you to freely fly anywhere. But if they added absolutely everything into Breath of the Wild, they would have no way to improve the next game. It would just be the same thing, but in a different world. As familiar as Majora's Mask was to Ocarina of Time by reusing the same models and some of the same items, they had a completely new world, new items, and a very unique mask mechanic that made it truly stand out on its own, even though it was made in just 1 year and reused almost everything from Ocarina of Time. So just imagine Nintendo applying this to Breath of the Wild. We get a game that uses the same engine and everything we loved about Breath of the Wild, but adds even more and expands on everything that made past Zelda games so great. If Breath of the Wild was Nintendo's first attempt at a truly open-world Zelda game on this scale, I mean, we know how amazing Breath of the Wild is compared to our expectations. So just imagine what their next attempt at an HD Zelda game will be like now that they have the experience learned from making Breath of the Wild, actually knowing what their new engine is capable of, and being able to take in all of the fan feedback and apply it to their next big Zelda game. With Breath of the Wild being such a masterpiece, despite all of these complaints, their next Zelda game will be nothing short of perfect. I want to thank you all for watching this video and welcome to the Enslate. If you're a fan of these videos, you can follow me on Twitter for updates on future videos at GameOverJesse. Please subscribe, like, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you would like to watch even more of my videos, click the video to the left or let me know what types of videos you would like to see in the future. I would like to take the rest of this time to thank all of my Patreon supporters. If you're a fan of this channel and would also like to help us out by becoming a Patreon supporter and get some awesome rewards for yourself, like being a part of my videos, shoutouts, custom avatars, giveaways, being added to our private Discord to chat during live streams, and more, please visit patreon.com/GameOverJesse, where even smaller supporters at the $1 level will get you some awesome stuff. Finally, a huge thank you to this month's supporters: George Says Hi, Link Uses the Triforce, Transcendent Sacred Courage, Glenn Cassio, Prey Warrior, Victopedia, Rusty Caulfield, Robert W., Amanda Pina, Lunarium, Chris Gasparin, Harris Priest, Lovable Christie, Key of Time 15, Jerome Measure, Daryl Quinnen, Furzin 16, Kadron, Magic Tech Review, and The Itch Network.